I was a man on a mission. I wanted to prove that Moltres was underrated and Scarlet and Violet overused. But how could I, a dude with a mid-elo hovering in the 1400 to 1500, I'm actually at like 1550 right now, range, ever properly make that argument to a higher ranked player? A bunch of math, because I'm a nerd. By professional training, I'm a data scientist, and I'm gonna stop doing the voice now. And I had to make sure that my method wouldn't just work for Moltres, it would have to work for every Pokemon. And so I have learned how to definitively quantify a Pokemon's offensive and defensive weaknesses in relation to other Pokemon. So here's the basic model. If I go over here, there's like something like 1,000 lines of code over here, so just like ignore this. This is the logic, okay? So the Pokemon damage formula is pretty long, and it has a lot of parameters. I'll list some of them, but like I skipped a lot of them in the actual model. So move power, stats, weather and terrain, crits, random rolls, burns, stab, and type matchup. There are only a few things that you can consistently have in the team builder, and I didn't have data for all of them, so I isolated what I had. So you can narrow in on the move power and stats and also typings as things that you have total control over from game to game. But the dataset I got from the Showdown API didn't contain movesets, so we're not counting those either. And also, if I spent all the time on the edge cases for damage calculations based off of specific abilities like a Drizzle or something, I would be here for months instead of like the 4 days it actually took me to make this project. So here's what we're actually left with, which is typing and stats. And here's how I model these things. So you might be thinking, how do you define how good a Pokemon is in general when a Pokemon is only good in relation to its specific metagame? And that's exactly how I evaluated it. I calculated the metrics for how Pokemon would fare against each other in terms of expected damage output in a one-on-one scenario, and then I took a bunch of averages across tiers to make it clear that this was a reliable and consistent metric to use. So here's the basic formula. You got your one-on-one score is type matchup. So you have the attacker and the defender. So the type matchup of the attacking move into the defender times the attacker's stat. So if it's, say, Great Tusk, that'll be a physical attacker, into the defender. So if it's a physical attacker, defender stat is defense, times faster, which is a coefficient of 1.3 in the case that the attacker is faster than the defender. I put in this to show that just a faster Pokemon is expected to hit more times, and I picked 1.3 because when I was testing numbers, that's the one that worked. There isn't really a particularly good reason other than it just made sense with the numbers that I was getting out. With type matchup, there's also the caveat that if it's a dual type Pokemon, then you need to be able to calculate the scenarios of both. So I just average the expected type score. So if I have something like Goldengo into Great Tusk, a fighting move is expected to have a type score of 0, while a ground type move is expected to have a type score of 2. So in that matchup of a ground fighting type into a steel ghost type, the offensive type matchup for the ground fighting type is going to be 1, because you're expecting to hit one time. Or you're expecting to hit either super effectively or nothing. So the average is 1. And then you adjust all of these numbers by the defender's HP stat divided by the average HP stat of all the Pokemon from PU to OU, which is 86.2. The average health HP stat among competitively viable Pokemon is remarkably consistent throughout the tiers, so this is a pretty easy number to use. And you divide by this because if the defender's health is lower than the average, then you're dividing by a fraction, which means you're multiplying. So you raise the expected damage, and if the defender's health is higher than the average, then you are saying that the defender's health is now above 1, so you're dividing by a number above 1, and that lowers the expected damage. And when you calculate the 1v1 score, you just calculate the stat on either side. So the attacker stat is on the attacker stat and the defender stat. You just swap the Pokemon. So for example, in the Great Tusk, here's some examples. In the Great Tusk fighting Goldengo matchup, you can see that they have pretty solid expected damage. I'll show you later what the average scores by tier look like, but just trust me when I say 1.6 is very average expected damage output or expected damage taken. So these are This is a pretty even matchup with a little bit higher than average expected damage output on either end, which makes sense. If Raging Bolt is fighting Clodsire, you see that he's not expected to deal a lot of damage, and he's expected to take more damage, but not that much because Clodsire doesn't have the greatest offensive stats in the world, and Raging Bolt is also pretty bulky. And if you're showing Skarmory fighting Clefable, this is, of course, not accounting for standard set. So, like, assume Skarmory has Iron Head or something. That Skarmory is expected to deal good damage to Clefable while not taking that much damage from Clefable. So this is more stuff that talks about everything I just said. You can go... I'll talk about my GitHub at the end, but this is all publicly available online. So then I need the next step to show how Pokemon generally match up against the rest of a tier. And to do this is pretty easy. I run this function up here once for every Pokemon in a tier. So I say Great Tusk versus Alomomola versus the next Pokemon in OU, the next Pokemon in OU, the next Pokemon in OU. Then I remember all of those scores together and I average them. And so you can see more examples here of how that works. So King Gambit versus the OU tier, you get an average defense score of 1.15, which is below average, meaning that you're expecting to take less damage. Showing the King Gambit is fairly bulky, with an average offense score of 1.61, which just so happens to be exactly the OU tier average. So he's above average defensively and average offensively if you're not accounting for his stupid abilities, because the model doesn't account for that. Volcarona is shown to be below average defensively, but above average offensively, but not so below average defensively as to be unusable. Then as another example, Kyogre, before Drizzle even, is already shown to be statistically very strong. Like, its stats are very high, because his average defense is very good, like on par with Walls, and its average offense is ridiculous. Hardly any Pokemon in the OU tier reach stats of that level, and Kyogre isn't even that fast. Then Frostmoth versus OU to show a really weak Pokemon. It can't switch into anything. An expected multiplier of 3.5 is absurd, over double the tier average. Well, its average offenses are pretty average, so it's definitely PU for a reason. And I'm going to show you some graphs to demonstrate that this is a general thing. Now, just before we look at the graphs themselves, you should know what a histogram looks like. A histogram, which you'll see in a bit, is basically a graph where it's a bar graph where you split a number line into buckets, and then you have a list of things, in this case Pokemon, that each have a numerical score, and you make a bar chart that measures how many Pokemon fall into each bucket. So you have, say, on a range of 0 to 5 for your number line, 0 to 1, and then 1 to 2, and then 2 to 3, and then 3 to 4, etc. And then the bars go up and down based off of how many things fall into that bucket. So a tall bar means a lot of Pokemon live in that number zone, and a short bar means a few Pokemon live in that number zone. Now, usually histograms will make a shape like a bell or a hill, where it's really tall in the middle and flattens out at the sides, because most of the scores will be pretty close to the average. And I call this, because I'm a stats person, a bell curve or a normal distribution. So first, let's look at the different tier averages so you just get an idea of what's normal. So you can see that a number somewhere between 1.5 and 2 is what a tier looks like, at least in Generation 9, for what people would probably consider to be a balanced or healthy-ish metagame, where the expected damage multiplier with my modifications for speed and for health is going to be about 1.6 or 1.7 or something like that for the tiers that are better off statistically. So skip this part. There we go. Here's the graph, okay? So this is the graph of each OU Pokemon's average score against the rest of the OU metagame. So you can see here, the OU tier average is 1.6. Up here, the reason that the averages are identical for defense and offense is because every time a score shows up on the defense end, the opposite score shows up on the offense end for a pair of Pokemon, and they both record that score. So the averages end up identical. But so you can see here in this graph that we have the bell curve or hill shape that we're expecting, with a couple of outliers over here. Like the 3.25 is Blissey, because Blissey's health stat is terrible, and I didn't account for... Blissey's defense stat is terrible, and I didn't account for that super well. Now, the OU tier average is 1.6, and you can see that most of the Pokemon
are above average offensively. They deal more damage than this line, and also are below average in terms of expected damage taken, meaning they're doing above average defensively. So if the Pokemon are good in the tier on average, the blue side will be leaning lower than the average, and the orange side will be leaning higher than the average, and that's what you see for the OU tier. Now, if we go down to the UU graph, you see that actually they're pretty dead even for the most part with the tier average, which means that they're performing a little bit worse overall because you're expecting the offensive Pokemon to be doing a little bit better than the tier average offensively, while the defensive Pokemon are doing a little bit better defensively than the tier average. Now, the UU Pokemon still individually has Pokemon that are very, very capable in the OU tier in terms of their stats and typings and move pools and all of that. But the graph shows that overall, they have a little bit of a harder time switching in and a little bit of a harder time dealing damage. And then, if we graph PU and OU, you can see that PU very strongly shows that the average Pokemon is taking more damage than is expected, and the average Pokemon is dealing less damage than is expected, and that these Pokemon are PU for a reason. That's why they're down there. So now for arguments about a couple of individual Pokemon, because this entire data science project was originally about Moltres, and my ADHD hyperfixation did not let me rest until I had finished this. So I think it's a Pokemon in Gen 9 OU that is really, really viable, and I run it with success on my teams in the mid to high elo range. It has good bulk, a good typing offensively and defensively, and it matches up well into Kingambit, Great Tusk, Iron Valiant, Goldengo, Rillaboom, Volcarona, Skarmory, and some other things I forgot on this list. And like that's a crazy matchup list. It's so good. And on top of that, Moltres has great defensive and offensive synergy with Kingambit and Great Tusk. These three Pokemon together are only weak to the water type and have immunities to electric, ground, and psychic type moves, which is insane roll compression. Just Moltres, Kingambit, and any grass dragon type is enough to have a viable switch into the entire type chart. Like, that's crazy to me, that Moltres and Kingambit slot together so well and people aren't using them. And then Moltres also has a lot of set flexibility while not suffering from 4 move slot syndrome, because based off of its EV spread, you're going to want it to do different things. I personally run it with a specially defensive set with Flame Body and Will-O-Wisp so that I can handle basically anything in the tier. That isn't super effective into it. But so it's a great burn spreader with Flame Body and Will-O-Wisp, and also it has Scorching Sand and Ancient Power for perfect coverage across everything. It has Flying and Fire Stab with Ground and Rock coverage, and U-Turn and Roost, and if you need it defensively as a phaser, Roar. So it has really good set flexibility with a small number of moves, meaning that even if the Moltres sets are somewhat predictable, they're still adaptable and super customizable, which is like super, super useful for a bulky pivot offensive Pokemon. Like, I don't know what this thing is doing in RU, and if you look at its stats are very good for the overused tier. At its average defense scores are on par with Pokemon like Heatran and Goldengo, and its offense scores are up there with Raging Bolt, Goldengo, and Heatran. Like, this thing, in terms of stats, is really good, and its expected type matchups into the tier are also fantastic. It just happens to match up very well into the tier. Free Moltres, it's good. It's this bulky with a recovery move and consistent stab options that hit the tier neutrally. Flamethrower hits everything really easily. Hurricane hits everything really easily. And then on top of that, it has great coverage options. Free Moltres, this thing needs to be used way, way more than it is. And another Pokemon I'd like to bring up is Keldeo. Keldeo is a good Pokemon, and literally everyone knows that, and everyone has known it since Generation 5, but because in Generation 7 and 8, Toxapex existed, and then Urshifu Rapid existed, Keldeo had a hard time seeing usage in OU. But I think now that it has Vacuum Wave, and Urshifu is gone, and Toxapex sucks, and Clodsire mostly sees use on stall, Keldeo is really being overlooked because of Generation 7 and 8. While it has really good competition from fighting and water types in the tier already, I think that there are plenty of novel team structures that I haven't really explored too much that Keldeo should be able to slot into when that use a lot of Pokemon that are not as commonly seen, where Keldeo can really, really shine. And I think that if you pair it with something like an Extra Drill or, say, an Iron Treads over Great Tusk, and then you have water and fighting type roll compression there, and then you pair it with a grass type like Rillaboom and maybe Moltres, like Great Tusk, Iron Treads, Rillaboom, Moltres, Keldeo Core would do really, really well in the overused tier. And then you slap on a couple of extra Pokemon. It faces good competition for the offensive water type slot, but it has really distinct advantages like Calm Mind, Vacuum Wave as special priority. It's got stuff, and its stats line up really well into the tier. Its defense score is, again, comparable to like Goldango or like Heatran. Like it defensively matches up well into the tier, and its average offense score is very, very high for the tier. Extremely high for the tier. 2.0. Like, that's a lot. That's like a whole standard deviation difference. It's a big difference. So I think that Keldeo is really, really underrated just because there are a lot of Pokemon that separately fulfill its role compression. But I think that you could slot this onto many teams and it should do very well, and that people have very much underexplored Keldeo. And then I made a couple of sample teams that I'm going to show in editing right over this. This stupid team with Moltres and Keldeo got me to 1500 elo pretty easily. I was not expecting Serena to make people pause in their tracks and absolutely panic the way it did over and over again. That was really funny. Now, a much more standard OU team with a Moltres Tusk Gambit core, it's going to perform really well. I've been testing the second one on here with the Slowking Galar set, and it's been doing really well, and there's actually really, really contentious debate, pros and cons wise, between Hatteran and Slowking Galar for this team. Preventing hazards is really important, but also being able to pivot inconsistently is really important. And then just in general, Moltres plus Kingambit, plus a ground type, plus a water type, plus a dragon or grass type, and then something to deal with the hazard metagame. Super strong and customizable template for an offense team, especially in the current meta where you have lots of Pokemon who compress some of these roles together. You have great ground types for that hazard game, Rillaboom is a premier grass type, and lots of great Groudon types to choose from. You can do a lot with this. Personally, I've been running Kyurem, Specs Kyurem, because it's silly and is stupid. The last topic I want to cover is abilities and moves. Speaking of Kyurem, what I've learned from this project is that yes, stats and type matchups matter a lot in how tiers are organized, but in modern generations, abilities and moves are what really break a Pokemon in the majority of cases. So if you look at the ice types that are in Ubers that used to be in OU versus the ones that are, versus Kyurem basically. So you have Kyurem, people are trying to ban it, right? Baxcalibur and Qianpao have successfully been banned. You look at their stats, Kyurem has an easier time switching into things and has a similar offense score to Baxcalibur and Qianpao across tiers, okay? So it's better defensively. Qianpao can't switch into anything. Baxcalibur can switch into things okay. In OU, things between Baxcalibur and Kyurem come together much more easily. And their offenses are pretty similar too. So they have pretty similar typings and matchup scores into Ubers and OU, offensively at least, and then Kyurem does better defensively. This is a typo. Pretend that this says Qianpao. So Kyurem was not banned, Qianpao and Baxcalibur were banned, and this comes down to abilities and move pools. See, Kyurem feels hard to deal with in OU just because it has amazing coverage options, good stats, and set diversity, but, you know, Baxcalibur and Qianpao also had really good coverage and good stats. And good sets. Not a crazy amount of diversity in their sets because they were really good. They're more one-dimensional, but you know? Good sets. So Kyurem can be a physical sweeper, a special wall breaker. It can do a bunch of defensive stuff with PP stalling. But Kyurem is still fine in Gen 9 because in the modern day, what really pushes a Pokemon over the edge is a special BS factor that either removes important counterplay or gives that Pokemon special treatment in the damage calculator. So Baxcalibur, its ability choice, just let it ignore some of the most important counterplay to physical sweepers, which was Burn. And it could immediately switch up just by switching into a fire type move, which is silly. And it also had the option to pick between priority, power, and coverage to pick its checks. So Baxcalibur was a Pokemon that had enough set diversity to be problematic, while also having the ability to remove specific counterplay that will beat it. While Qianpao is naturally really fast, has an ability that boosts the damage of all of its attacks by 33%, which is insane. A 1.33 damage multiplier is stupid for something with high stats that's already fast. It has 2 stab priority moves, perfect offensive coverage, and Swords Dance. So again, you see a lot of set diversity narrowed into this offensive role for Baxcalibur and Qianpao. And and Chi and Pao get super special treatment in the damage calculator and lots of ways to stop any fair counterplay. So both Excalibur and Chi and Pao have ways of stopping counterplay while still having set diversity and power. So they're stupid. With Kyurem, it's strong and it has more set diversity than Excalibur and Chi and Pao. But all of Kyurem's individual sets do not have special treatment in the damage calculator, and each set has the same conventional counterplay that would apply to any other Pokemon filling the same role that Kyurem's specific set is doing. If you want to stop Kyurem's sub PP stall set, you use Taunt on it and it shuts it down. If you want to deal with the physical sweeper set, you can deal with it with priority moves. You can deal with it with burns. If you want to stop the special attacking set, you can switch in with bulky walls, and the special attacking sets either lack some power if you're using a boots variant, or are very prediction reliant with the specs variant. Although, using the Kyurem specs variant, I'm going to say that Ice Beam hits too much of the tier, and people don't build enough to counter it properly. Now, setup moves, priority moves, and abilities that change damage calculations are the things that get Pokemon banned often. Because these moves are the easiest way to remove counterplay from Pokemon, and priority moves on a sweeper remove the option to revenge kill the sweeper, and set up more offensive abilities that boost damage or ignore certain aspects of the type chart, remove options like switching in safely to the sweeper or outspeeding the sweeper. So modern day OU is full of Pokemon with these options, and you need to have a really good defensive profile, or defensive abilities like Unaware to compete defensively in modern day Gen 9 OU. So a Pokemon that would normally be in UU or RU or even PU can magically leap up to OU if it's given a BS factor, which is why modern starters keep getting broken stuff like the Grassy Surge, Grassy Glide combo, or Protean and Libero, and it's why Pokemon like Quagsire and Clefable stay eternally relevant in OU, even though they really shouldn't be able to, because of good typing and abilities like Magic Guard or Unaware give them a special defensive BS factor. So to sum this section up, OK stats minus bullshit is a low tier Pokemon. OK stats with BS is a high tier Pokemon. Good stats minus BS is a high tier Pokemon. And then good stats plus BS is an overpowered Pokemon. But on average, good Pokemon have good stats and typing, and the BS factor can only do so much. And now we use this combination of knowledge and stats and 3 days of my entire life to make a team builder that can tell you in advance if your team sucks. One that lets the noobs know what is good and what is bad without needing an expert on hand, and one that lets experienced team builders quickly find hidden gem Pokemon in lower tiers that are much more viable than expected. So how do we do that with all of the stats that I just did and spent like 4 days on? A good, well-balanced team in any tier should have the following traits. It should have a resistance or immunity to every type. It should be able to hit every type for neutral stab damage, and the average offense and defense scores for the team should be similar to or better than the tier average. Offensive teams should have a higher average offense score than the tier average, or a close to average one, and be okay with a higher average defense score than the tier average. While a more defensive team should make the opposite trade-off of a lower average defense score, meaning lower expected damage output on them, and a lower average offense score. Now, a smart team builder can tell you all this stuff, which is why I spent like 2 days plus a bunch of debugging time on building a smart team builder by compressing everything into one function. So again, my GitHub, which is going to be linked in the description to this video, has the smart team builder in it, and you can use it right out of the box. All you really need to do is you have your list of Pokemon here. So let's say Moltres and King Gambit, and Kyurem. And then the tier that you want to test your team for. Everything here uses the Showdown API, so if the tiers ever shift, the team builder will still be accurate. And then I click the button. You can test anywhere from 1 to 6 Pokemon, then it calculates everything. So my team's average offense score is above average. So it tells me what percentage above average I'm expected to do for my damage output. And then for defense, it's telling me how much less damage I'm expected to take than average based off of the damage multipliers. So my team is above average offensively and above average defensively. I can hit every type for neutral or super effective damage, and I can switch into and safely resist any type. And then it tells me overall what I need to work on. So now let's take a look at Pokemon with really poor typings, like say Beedrill and let's say Beedrill and Rabami. and have that be my team. So my team deals less damage than average. It takes a lot more damage than average. And I get told all of the types that I struggle with. So I can't hit poison or steel types neutrally. And all of these types, because bug is a terrible defensive typing, I can't switch into with a resist. So all of these types are not covered with a resist. And then it tells me, you know, my team's incomplete or like it's gimmicky or something, and that I should basically try to match the metagame better with stats and typings, and making sure that the types on my team are well-rounded. So that's the smart team builder I built. If you take anything away from this video, Moltres is good in the tier, and I did statistical analysis to prove it. Keldeo is good in the tier, and I did statistical analysis to prove it. And if you suck at the game, I built a team builder that can fix your team for you. Not actually fix your team for you, but it tells you what you need to fix on your own. So use that. And even if you're an experienced player with a higher elo, when you're building a new team, it's pretty difficult to account for the entire type chart. So use my team builder to make sure that the type chart is being used correctly. And use my team builder to see if your team is actually good. Now, the user interface for this is terrible. It's an online version of what I just showed you, where you type into this list, and you type in your tier, and then you click a button, and there's no graphics or no nothing, and everything is just printed out the bottom. If somebody wants to do the stuff with the GitHub, if they want to make a fork, and they want to make a UI, and they want to help make this into a real website, please go ahead and do that. I am completely happy to work with that person if they feel like doing it. Regardless, this has been Pokemon Data Science, and I don't know, I might make more videos to show you guys hidden gems in the metagame based off of some data mining or statistical analysis that I already have all of the infrastructure to make within this one GitHub repository.